Let's toast to Julian's charmingly simple life. Teaching at that community college and driving that old bicycle. It must be nice to have such limited ambitions.
He's with me. Four simple words, dropped like an amble into the quiet chatter of the Grandview country. Club main hall. Victor Sterling stood mid-boast, a glass of champagne tilted in his hand. He had been mocking Julian Mercer's rusted 20-year-old Ford, his calloused hands and his simple, broken life. But then, high-heeled footsteps clicked across the marble floor. The entire room turned. Helena Vance, the brilliant, untouchable, 35-year-old CEO, running one of Connecticut's most respected firms, stepped beside Julian. She placed a quiet hand on his forearm and shut Victor down. In front of everyone he was trying to impress. What nobody in that room knew was what had happened in the 6 hours leading up to that moment. 6 hours earlier, in a quiet, two-story house in West Hartford, Julian stood in front of his bathroom mirror, trying to remember how his late wife, Clara, used to knot his Windsor tie. His tie hung in two loose, stubborn loops. Sitting on the stairs, watching him, was 9-year-old Chloe. She held a folded handkerchief embroidered with the letter C. "Daddy, I know you're doing it wrong," she said softly, handing him the handkerchief. Julian ran his thumb over the embroidery. Then he tucked it carefully into his inside jacket pocket and kissed the top of her head. "I won't be late tonight," he promised. "You always say that, and you always are." Chloe smiled, missing her front tooth, before running back upstairs to her drawing pad. Across the city, on the 14th floor of a glass tower overlooking the river, Helena Vance was reviewing a speech she had written twice. As CEO of Apex Capital, she was attending the alumni reunion to present an educational endowment check. Apex was one of the state's premier firms, yet in her 3 years as CEO, Helena had never once met the anonymous billionaire founder who owned it. She only knew he preferred to stay in the shadows. When Julian pulled his 20-year-old Ford truck into the gravel lot of the club, he hesitated before opening the door. He hadn't stepped inside this building since he was 22. Inside the entry hall, he crossed paths with Helena. Seeing him pat his pockets, she asked, "Do you have a light?" "Sorry, I don't smoke," Julian said. "Neither do I," Helena replied, gesturing to a board member nearby. She caught a glimpse of his flannel collar poking out from beneath his blazer. No judgment, no snide comment, just a brief glance, before she walked away. Moments later, Victor Sterling cornered Julian with a glass of bourbon in hand, and the same arrogant sneer he'd carried since the 11th grade. Throwing a heavy arm around Julian's shoulders, Victor made sure the surrounding tables were watching. "You actually came." "Brave man," Victor smirked. "So what do you actually do now, Mercer? Still doing carpentry? Birdhouses?" "Architectural consulting," Julian replied calmly, gently sliding Victor's arm off his shoulder. "Small homes, mostly." Victor laughed loudly, riding the attention of the room. During dinner, as Victor continued his passive-aggressive jabs, the club's facilities manager suddenly rushed up to the head table. He whispered in alarm to the board members about structural stress on the main hall's heavy chandelier. Victor waved a dismissive hand. "Call an engineer, Jesus. We're trying to eat." Julian set his fork down. He touched the manager's elbow. "Show me." Julian was gone for 8 minutes. When he returned, there was a thin streak of dust along his cuff. He quietly sat back down and resumed his meal. Seconds later, the manager rushed back to Helena. He whispered that the man from table 4 had inspected the structural issue and manually retensioned the backup brace. Helena turned in her chair. She didn't look at Julian's face. She looked at his wrist. As Julian reached for the bread basket, his sleeve shifted, catching the handle light. On his wrist was a rare, vintage timepiece, the white-dial gold Calatrava. Helena's breath caught. She had seen that exact watch only once before, in a restricted, confidential folder labeled "Founder Personal" on her very first day as CEO. The face in the photograph had been blurred for privacy, but the watch had not. Under the table, Helena pulled out her phone and texted Arthur Pendleton, outside legal counsel for Apex Holdings. "Is he here tonight?" 3 dots appeared. Then Arthur's reply, "Don't ask me that, Helena. Just be careful what you say in that room." Helena excused herself to the side hallway. She stepped into the club library, where Arthur was waiting. "Tell me," Helena demanded softly, "is he the principal?" Arthur let out a long breath. He opened a leather folio on the desk and turned a single page. It was the notarized trust document for Apex Holdings, listing Julian A. Mercer as the founder and sole voting shareholder. Below it was an anonymous education endowment schedule listing named beneficiaries over the past decade. Halfway down, Helena's eyes landed on a name, Victor S. Sterling, Executive MBA Fellowship, $48,000. Helena stared in utter shock. For 7 years, the man who was currently trying to humiliate Julian Mercer had been earning his executive degree on Julian Mercer's money. He set the trust up after his wife's diagnosis, Arthur explained. Quietly, he reads every application blind and votes anonymously. He voted yes on Victor's file because he never wanted anyone to feel beholden to him. When Helena returned to the main hall, Victor was taking his humiliation scheme even further. Standing up without a microphone, he raised his glass and called for the room's attention. "Friends," Victor shouted across the tables, "I think we all deserve to know who's really sitting among us tonight. Julian Mercer here has been telling stories about his little business, but I did some digging. Mercer Architectural Consulting files an annual revenue under $50,000. It's a shell, gentlemen. Tax write-off. The man living off his late wife's life insurance." Gasping erupted across the room. Victor turned smugly toward Helena. "So forgive me, Helena, if I find it curious that the chief executive officer of Apex Capital is sitting beside a man who hasn't filed real income in 5 years. What exactly are you with?" Helena moved to speak, but Julian's hand lightly brushed her wrist, a silent signal. Julian stood up slowly. He put his hands in his pockets. He didn't yell. He didn't square his shoulders aggressively. "Victor," Julian said quietly, "sit down." The sheer authority in his voice caused the room to drop half a level in volume. "My name is Julian Mercer," he said, his voice carrying cleanly. "I run a small architectural consultancy out of my garage." That part is true. What Victor did not find in his research is that I also founded a private holding company called Apex Holdings after my wife passed. Apex Holdings is the sole owner of Apex Capital, where Helena is the CEO, and where you, Victor, serve as Senior Vice President of Client Acquisitions. Victor went completely pale. His face turned the color of old paper. "I set the company up anonymously because after Clara died, I wanted my daughter to grow up with a father, not a portfolio. And for the record, Victor, I have read every application that came through the Apex Trust for the past 10 years, yours included. You wrote that a man's worth is measured by the people he refuses to step on. I voted yes on your fellowship. I have not been sorry about that vote until tonight." Victor tried to speak, but his voice broke on the second word. He looked around. Not a single person in the room would meet his eye. Humiliated, he set his glass down on the table and slunk out toward the exit. Later that night, Julian stood out on the stone terrace, watching a yellow leaf blow across the dark 18th fairway. Helena walked out to join him. "Why didn't you tell me earlier?" she asked softly. "When I stood up and said he's with me, you could have stopped me." "Because for the first time in 20 years, Julian said gently, someone stood up for me without knowing what I had. Just because they thought it was right. I didn't want to take that away from either of us." Helena smiled, looking out at the night. "I'll have Arthur brief the board on Monday, though I think I've been running the company pretty well on my own." "You ran it exceptionally well," Julian agreed. "I read every quarterly report. I never had to step in once." On Sunday morning, warm sunlight streamed through the windows of the Park Road diner. Helena sat in a corner booth in a cozy navy sweater, sipping coffee. The bell over the door jingled. Julian walked in holding Chloe's hand. Chloe marched up to the booth, carrying a stuffed panda under her arm. "His name is Barnaby," Chloe announced, holding the stuffed animal up. "He doesn't drink coffee, but he likes pancakes." Barnaby and I have something in common. Helena smiled, making room for Chloe in the booth. Julian slid a brown envelope of official company documents across the table, but Helena didn't open it. Instead, she pulled a small folded napkin from her pocket. It featured a pencil sketch of a unique staircase bracket. I saw this joint design in a historic house in Wethersfield 5 years ago, Helena said softly. The realtor told me the original architect had passed away. Julian looked at the sketch, smoothing the napkin with his thumb. That was Clara's design, he said gently. That was our first house. She was brilliant, Julian, Helena said. I think I have been walking through her legacy for years, without realizing it. Outside the diner window, autumn light settled across Julian's worn Ford and Helena's sedan parked side by side. And inside the booth, amid the smell of coffee and pancakes, a new story quietly began.